Chapter 16. As soon as Summer's seatbelt clicked, Grant asked the question that had been humming in the back of his mind ever since Kathleen had given them a name. "You looked up the female professors last night. Wasn't one of them a Bannister?" Summer pressed her lips together, looked up toward the Land Rover ceiling, and then nodded. "I think maybe." On his cell phone, Grant navigated to the email Brian's friend had sent and tapped on the list. "Right here, Beverly Bannister." "An heiress," Summer said. "Could explain how they can afford a house on the coast." Grant dialed and pulled into traffic. "What's up?" John asked in lieu of hello. "I'm here with Summer," Grant said. "Can you research someone for us?" "Sure. Did any of those other leads pan out?" "None of the ones we sent you yesterday, but I have a good feeling about this one. 2 names, Richard and Beverly Bannister. We think they're married." "Any idea where they live?" "According to this," Grant said, "Beverly's a professor at UNH. I'll get right on it. Summer, you all right?" "I'm good." "Grant's on his best behavior?" He scowled at the speaker, and Summer smiled. "As good as he gets, I suppose." John didn't sound amused. "Grant, remember what I told you?" "Thanks for your help, man." He disconnected the phone. "Told you about what?" Summer asked. "He's just worried about your safety." Which was true, but in this case, John was thinking about a different kind of safety than what Summer probably assumed. Not that Grant needed the reminder. Summer wasn't the type of woman to let a guy take advantage, and Grant certainly wasn't the type to try. The fact that his best friend didn't know him better. "Where are we headed now?" she asked. "Hopefully John will find that address, and we can either cross it off the list or, if it's on the coast, swing by." And then? That was the question. He was driving toward the interstate but had no definite destination in mind. They could rent a couple of rooms in Portsmouth, but figuring Ramon had his name, he didn't want to run his credit card, or Summer's. How did one go about finding hotels that accepted cash, that didn't need to run a credit card for incidentals? Did such a place exist? If it did, would it be the kind of place he'd want to take Summer? What other options were there? He could reach out to a couple of former clients from that summer, Thomas and Josie. He didn't know them well, but John had introduced them the weekend he'd moved into his apartment. Thomas had an apartment over his business. Maybe they could stay there. He handed his phone to Summer. "Text John and ask him for Thomas Wyndham's phone number." "He lives in Coventry." "Yeah, I'm going to call." "That's way out of the way." "You have a better idea?" Yeah, your brother." "I don't want to go back to Brian's." When she said nothing, he glanced her way and found her staring at him. "What? What happened between you two?" The last thing he wanted was to tell her the most horrible thing in his life. But she had asked. She cared enough to want to know. And by the way she was looking at him, she was genuinely curious. So maybe he was angling onto I-95 when his phone rang, too loud in the quiet car. He pressed the button on the steering wheel to answer. "This is Grant." "Hey, sweetie." His mother's voice was more cheerful than usual. "I'm glad I caught you. Brian said you were in the area." "I was last night," Grant said. "Oh." The single syllable had lost some of its cheer. "I was hoping Camilla and the kids are here for the weekend. Everyone's meeting at the camp." "I didn't know they were coming." "We didn't either until yesterday. She doesn't like to broadcast their plans. You know, with the people who..." Her voice faded. "That makes sense," Grant said quickly. "I'm glad she's being cautious." "So?" Mom sounded so hopeful. "Can you come?" He glanced at Summer, who was watching him closely. "I'm not alone." "Brian said you're traveling with your partner. John's cousin, right? He's talked about her before. I'm sure she's a lovely woman." Summer smiled at the compliment. "Yes, she's something. She's right here, actually." "Oh, hello, dear. I'm Peggy." "Hi. Nice to sort of meet you. Hopefully we'll meet in person. If you two are going to be around, that is." "I'd love that." Summer sounded genuinely eager, meaning Grant would get no help from her. He could think of no good excuse to avoid his family, and he couldn't imagine a safer place for the two of them to hole up. Plus, he wouldn't mind seeing Daniel's widow and kids. "We're not prepared for the ride," Grant said. "Dad can bring blankets. We're already here." Well, obviously, Dad and I have come back for supplies. We've already got the stoves going. He caught Summer's confusion out of the corner of his eye. Ha! If she thought this conversation was weird, wait until she saw the place and met the rest of his family. Brian'll be there? Already is, Mom said. He's gathering wood. It would mean so much to your father and me. To all of us. Grant couldn't think of a single excuse not to go, aside from the long, long drive. But what else did they have to do? Fine. Great. Her enthusiasm started his heart pounding, nerves, anxiety, and maybe a little bit of anticipation bubbling up. He loved his family, every one of them. It wasn't their fault that he'd wrecked his place with them. I'll let Dad know, Mom said. Call when you know your ETA, and try to get here before sundown. I remember, see you soon. He ended the call, shaking his head. I'm not sure if you're going to thank me or curse me for this. She seems nice. Mom? Yeah, she's the best. Dad, too. But between them and my brothers, and my sister-in-law and her kids, and my grandparents will probably be there, it'll be total chaos. Really? She seemed not put off but excited by the prospect. I think I can handle it. He had no doubt she could. The question was, could he? Do me a favor, he said. Call John and find out if he's close to getting an address. She used Grant's phone, so John's abrupt, I'm working on it, came through the speakers. Wow, Summer said. Annoyed much? Sorry, thought you were Grant. Richard and Beverly Bannister own a house in Durham, but she comes from money. Couple of trust funds, a nonprofit. It'll take some work to track down all the properties they own. I'm going to need more time. No problem, Summer said. Grant and I are headed to his family's camp? She looked at him for confirmation, and he nodded. Mom called, Grant said. Camilla and the kids are in town, so... That's great, John said. I can't think of a safer place. Is the whole family going? Yup. So you'll be off the grid for a while? Sam got a satellite or something. No cell service, but we should have Wi-Fi. I'll let you know if I learn anything, John said. We have until... when? Summer fielded that. Ramon just said it would be sometime next week. A few days then, John said. We need eyes on the property well in advance. Grant's tone was serious. One step at a time. I'm working as fast as I can. Yeah, I know. Grant ended the call. Traffic was stacking up all around him. Along with typical commuters, there'd be vacationers headed north. It was the first weekend in May, and though it was forecasted to be cloudy, the people were ready for springtime. And like Grant's family, plenty of folks would want to get away to vacation homes, regardless of the weather. He slowed to well below the speed limit and inched along with the crowd. Beside him, Summer sighed. There's something to be said for living in the city. At least I don't have to deal with this. She waved toward the cars all around. Should I put the address in the GPS so we can give your mother an idea what time we'll be there? Aren't you going to ask? What? He'd expected her to grill him about the camp. What kind of a place has no cell service? Why will we need blankets for the ride? Are the stoves the only form of heat? He just lifted his eyebrows, waiting for her to voice the questions. But she said, I trust you not to take me any place too rustic. He chuckled. You're giving me, and my family, more credit than we deserve. I am a little concerned with your brother out looking for firewood. Oh, there's plenty of firewood for the stoves. That's not what he's doing. So? Nope. You said you trusted me. I'm not giving anything away. They were stopped in traffic now. He tapped the town into his phone, made note of the arrival time, and texted his mom. Might as well settle in. He gestured to the cars all around. We've got about 3 hours of this ahead of us. Summer groaned, and Grant smiled. One thing he could say about his family's camp, no chance Ramon would stumble across them out there.
Chapter 17. Summer spoke with Crystal and was cautiously appeased that her older sibling was not in imminent danger. But Misty, the call to her younger sister, brought Summer only angst. The DA had assigned someone to guard her, and Misty seemed satisfied she was protected. Summer wasn't sure she agreed, but her sister wouldn't be talked into accepting protection from their agency. There was nothing she could do but pray. Grant parked, and Summer gripped the handle of a bag containing fresh-baked cookies. She'd insisted he stop along the way. Maybe he didn't feel the need to take a gift to his parents, but she was about to intrude on a family gathering. The least she could do was bring something. She'd suggested they pull into the liquor store off the interstate in New Hampshire, but he'd nixed that idea. "We're not really drinkers. We'll open a bottle of champagne on special occasions, but half the time we end up dumping most of it out. That stuff's disgusting." Not drinkers? She knew Grant didn't drink, but the whole family? She liked the Wrights already. Considering her father's battle with alcoholism, she hardly touched the stuff and didn't like being around people who did. Knowing she wouldn't have to deal with that tonight made her even more eager to get to this so-called camp. But when she climbed from John's SUV and looked around, she figured this couldn't be their final destination. Where in the world were they? Grant hadn't been kidding about the 3-hour drive. They'd passed the exit they'd taken to Brian's house in Brunswick, then ambled their way along a 2-lane highway for an hour and a half. She'd had no idea they were even near the coast until a couple of moments before, when she'd caught sight of the gunmetal gray waters of the Atlantic. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." Hefting both their duffel bags, Grant slammed the tailgate closed. "Ready? I guess." "This way." He walked through the parking lot, past a small brick building, and turned down an alley. The wind kicked up, bringing a chill and the sense of fish and brine. At the end, the Atlantic spread out before them. "Come on!" Grant looked back at her, and she realized she'd stopped to take in the scene. So unlike Newburyport, this town was a true fishing village. The few people she saw were men, some bearded, most rough-looking, though one smiled when she caught his gaze. She followed Grant onto a boardwalk, and they walked down a long pier lined with boats in their slips. A sense of unease churned in her stomach. What were they doing at a marina? These weren't fancy yachts or sporting boats. They were mostly fishing boats, or maybe lobstering. "There's our ride." Grant lifted his hand in a wave, and up ahead, a man hopped off a speedboat onto the pier and started toward them. He was tall like Grant, though slimmer. He wore a knit cap, a thick parka, jeans, and hiking boots. His smile was wide, crinkling the skin around his eyes and mouth. He looked just like she figured Grant would in 30 years. Handsome, fit, and distinguished. Grant had barely dropped the duffels when he was enveloped in a big backslapping hug. "How are you, son? I'm so glad you made it." "Me too." Grant stepped back, his own smile wide. "Dad, this is Summer Lake. Summer, my dad." She held out her hand. "Mr. Wright, pleasure to meet you." He took her hand in both of his palms almost as warm as his welcome. "Call me Roger, it's a pleasure to meet you." He stepped back, gave her a head-to-toe appraisal, and said, "Yup, you're John's cousin, all right. You got his eyes. And height, obviously. Course you're better looking than he is." He winked at her. "And you can tell him I said that." "Thanks for the invite." She liked Roger already. "The more the merrier." He turned to Grant. "We're just waiting on Derek and Maria." "She's coming?" Grant asked. "Been working as Nana and Pop's nurse. They were going to make the trip without her, to prove they didn't need her, I think. But then they forgot their meds." Roger rolled his eyes. "She's gonna stay the weekend. You two make yourselves at home. Your mom stuffed a bunch of blankets in there." He waved vaguely to the boat, then wandered toward shore. Grant gave Summer a look that could only be seen as challenging. "You ready for this?" That sense of unease expanded to full-blown anxiety. "What are we doing? I don't know what this is." He laughed and hopped onto the boat, dropped the duffels, and then turned back and held out his hand. "Come on, let's find those blankets." She looked from Grant to the tiny motorboat. Unlike the others in the harbor, this one looked more designed for sport than work. It had a small roof that covered only the front half. Lined with benches on the back and both sides, it was low to the water. Probably fast. Definitely terrifying. Dad had rented a speedboat once for the family. She'd loved the feeling of the wind in her hair as he'd sped across the lake, but he'd brought a cooler of beer. As the day wore on, as the cooler emptied of cans, he'd gotten reckless, taking more and more chances. After a sharp turn that had nearly resulted in a crash with a jet ski, Mom had tried to get him to slow down or relinquish the wheel. They'd argued. Dad pushed her away, and Mom flew over the edge. Summer could still see her, reaching for the railing, missing, flying, splashing into the water, and disappearing beneath. Dad just drove on. Maybe only for a minute or two, but to Summer it had seemed like hours. Finally, he spun around to pick her up, laughing as if it had all been a big game. Dripping but no longer arguing, Mom climbed into the boat. She'd been fine. But Summer would never get that image out of her head of her mother's body hurling through the air. The only other time she'd been on a boat was for a photo shoot back in her modeling days, and it had been a 60-foot yacht rented for the occasion. They'd motored a couple of 100 yards from shore, spent a couple of hours posing, and then gone back. Even then, surrounded by the warm waters of the Caribbean, she'd been afraid. She'd lived in New York for years, but she'd never taken the ferry out to see the Statue of Liberty, and not because she wasn't curious. They were going to ride this tiny little speedboat on the ocean. She was already cold. They'd freeze before they got wherever they were going. And that was assuming they made it. What if the boat stalled or flipped? Hey! Grant shifted into her view. It's okay. I don't like boats. I didn't know that. His lips twitched at the corners, like he thought she was amusing. It's not funny. No, of course not. He pressed his lips together, swallowed. It's just the irony that a woman named Summer Lake. Yeah, I get it. She sounded annoyed. Well, she was annoyed. He should have told her. Her own fault. She should have asked. It had never occurred to her. Is there another way to get there? The camp's on an island. It's this, or we find a hotel. Or drive to Coventry. Maybe Thomas could still put us up. But, as much as he'd balked at the idea of seeing his family, the closer they'd gotten, the more eager he'd seemed. He'd been humming along with the music on the radio for the last hour. She didn't want to disappoint him. And really, was she going to let a little thing like this boat stand in her way? Yes. No. I promise, Grant said. You'll be perfectly safe. I won't let anything happen to you. Right. Like he could single-handedly ensure the boat wouldn't sink. But the look he gave her, all confidence and kindness, settled her nerves. A little. Come on, it's freezing. Let's find a blanket. His hand still hovered in the space between the boat and the dock. She stuck her arm through the handles of the sack and reached out. He gripped her firmly. She took a deep breath and stepped through the little opening in the flimsy railing. The boat moved. Or maybe she pushed too hard. Or maybe both. She stumbled forward, nearly losing her footing. But Grant pulled her into his chest, wrapping her tightly. You're okay. His words rumbled in her ear. I've got you. She stayed there, in the safety of his arms, while the boat settled beneath her. Finally, she pushed back and looked up. The humor was missing from his expression. His warm brown eyes searched her face. Is it all right? She nodded, tried to speak, but her throat was thick with fear or tension or something. She averted her gaze. She'd already confessed her fear. The last thing she needed was to let him see it in her expression. He still held her hand. Don't trip over the duffels. I'll stow them in a minute. He walked her to a bench along the side and beneath the small roof. She sat and wrapped her arms around herself. The wind was frigid. Grant lifted the bench seat in the back and pulled out a couple of blankets. Here we go. A loud thump, and the boat swayed in the water. Summer gasped. Once again, Grant seemed to be fighting a smile. He looked toward the front of the boat. You made it. A man a little shorter than Grant hugged him as his father had. Hey, bro, it's been too long. I know. Grant stepped back. Derek, this is my partner, Summer. Summer waved but didn't dare stand. A pretty dark-haired beauty headed for the opposite bench. Hi, I'm Maria. No relation to these guys. She sent the men an affectionate look. Just the next-door neighbor and nurse to their grandparents. You guys can chat when we get there. The boat swayed again as Roger climbed aboard. It's getting dark. Grant tossed his brother a blanket, tossed another to Maria, and draped a third over Summer. It was amazing how warm the scratchy wool felt. Right back. While his father started the engine and backed out of the slip, the movement only adding to her anxiety, Grant lifted the bench seats to stow their 2 duffel bags, Derek's backpack, and Maria's small-wheeled luggage. He walked to the front, said something to his father, who laughed and nodded, and returned to sit beside her. "You want a life jacket?" he asked. "Do I need one?" She hadn't meant the terror to bleed into her words, but there it was, audible enough for even Derek to hear. He was kind enough to avert his gaze, though not so fast that she missed his smile. "Dad could do this with his eyes closed," Grant said. "You're safe, I promise." "Then, no, I guess." Grant settled beside her. "Mind if I share?" She lifted the blanket, and he draped it over himself with one hand, while the other slid across her shoulders. "We might as well keep each other warm, if you don't mind, that is." Mind? The only thing holding her panic at bay was Grant's proximity. She nestled into his side, forcing a breath to calm her chattering teeth. When they were away from the dock, Roger pushed the lever forward, and they took off across the choppy waters. Summer squeezed her eyes closed and prayed. The ride was terrifying, but less than 15 minutes after they left the marina, the boat slowed, and Summer risked opening her eyes. They approached a tree-covered island that led to rocky slopes angling, in some places, very steeply, to the coast. She couldn't figure out where they were going to land until they rounded a bend. The cliff was no less steep, but it wasn't as high here, and a dock with a little boathouse jutted into the water. Grant nudged Summer and pointed. She had to lean out from under the boat's small roof to see. When the house on the top of the cliff came into view, Summer gasped. It was 3 stories, mostly stone, with windows everywhere. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but not this. "I thought you said it was a camp." Grant shoved the blanket off himself. "I gotta help. You'll be okay for a sec?" "Sure." She sounded confident, but when he stood and hopped onto the dock, her pulse raced. Sitting across from her, Maria smiled. "They know what they're doing." "You've been here before?" She shook her head. "But they've been doing this for years. I have every confidence." Grant and Derek tied up the boat, then unloaded the bags. Summer should probably move, but she'd be more of a hindrance than a help. She stayed where she was, ashamed of her fear. Had she really hugged Grant when she'd first gotten onto this floating death trap? Had she really let herself nestle into him during the ride? Horrifying! No, she wouldn't show any more weakness, not now, not while she was here, and not when they were on their way back. She could conquer this. But after Maria hopped ashore like an old pro, Summer couldn't wait any longer. She stood, lifting the bag with the cookies in it. But the boat rocked, and she gripped a support pole as if it were her only link to safety. Grant hopped back on like it was nothing and held out his hand. "I got you." "I can do it." She ignored his hand and made her way to the opening in the railing that led to the dock. Only a few inches separated the boat from the solid wood. Derek stood on the far side, reaching toward her. "Grab my hand." She didn't want to be rude, but she didn't want his help either. Everybody else had gotten off without aid. She hopped the few inches, managed to keep her feet, and straightened. "Thanks anyway." Derek shifted his focus to Grant behind her. "Go on up. Maria's already halfway there. I guess Pop needs his medication. Dad and I can take care of this." "I don't mind helping," Grant said. Summer grabbed her duffel bag in her free hand and moved out of the way. Roger was still on the boat, digging into one of the storage compartments. "She's a guest," Derek said. "And for as often as you come." "Yeah, I got it." Annoyance infused his words. He bent and grabbed his duffel, then reached for hers. "Let me take that." "I can carry it." His eyebrows lifted, but he just shrugged. "At least give me the sack." She was going to argue, but by the look in his eyes, she figured it wasn't worth it. She handed the cookies over, and he turned and marched toward the end of the dock. He was definitely annoyed. With his brother? She didn't know as she followed him. All she could see ahead in the gathering darkness was what looked like a solid wall, but lights placed every 10 feet or so snaked up the side of it. Oh, and there was Maria, nearly to the top already. As they approached, she realized a metal staircase had been attached to the stone cliff. Grant paused at the bottom. Ladies first. Hang on to the railing. Thanks to the ocean spray, the steps can be slick. She shifted her bag into her left hand and gripped the cold metal railing with her right. You sure you won't let me carry that for you? Grant asked. I can manage. But she understood now why he'd offered. The steps were steep and slippery, and her small bag kept bouncing into them, getting in her way. She paused, slipped her arms through the handles of the duffel so it acted like a backpack, and climbed what seemed the equivalent of 3 flights until she reached the top and stepped past a low stone wall onto a beautiful grass-covered lawn. She took in the giant house in front of her. Light spilled from nearly every window. Smoke from chimneys filled the air with its homey scent, which always reminded her of John's house in the wintertime. Unlike her family, they used to gather around the fireplace on snowy days, roast marshmallows, and tell stories. Those were some of her favorite memories. It's gorgeous! Beside her, Grant said, I forget sometimes. Will you please let me carry your bag? Otherwise, my mother'll lecture me about how to treat a lady. I'm begging you. She shimmied her bag off her back. Only if you let me take that. She nodded to the sack, and they traded. I wouldn't want to get you in trouble. You think I'm kidding? You have no idea. He nodded toward the first floor, and she peered through the sliding doors at a ping-pong table. And, was that an air hockey game? That's the game room, he said. The family will be gathered in the kitchen and living room, up here. They took a gravel walkway to an outdoor staircase that led to a wide, covered deck where outdoor furniture was stored beneath canvas. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she counted 8 people, all standing around a huge island, cooking, eating, smiling and laughing, all talking, at the same time, or so it seemed. The low murmur of conversation carried through the glass. The gang's all here, Grant said. You ready? I guess. You look almost as scared as you were when you realized we'd be traveling by boat. I'm not scared, just, my family's not that big, or talkative. I warned you, Grant said. She straightened her shoulders, plastered on a smile. It's fine, let's go. His smile was genuine. Don't worry, they're going to love you. He crossed the deck and slid open a door. Go on. She stepped inside, Grant right behind her. Immediately, everybody turned their direction. You made it, a man called. Told you, another voice said. You owe me $10. You two. That came from a woman who smacked one of the oversized males as she walked by. She approached Grant, and he enveloped her in his arms. I'm so glad to see you. Me too. Grant hugged his mother tightly. The murmur of conversation died. Everybody in the room stared. Finally, Grant stepped away. Mom, everybody, this is Summer. He gave her a quick, nervous look. That okay? He said low. Or should I tell them to call you Lake? It's fine. She stuck out her hand to his mother. Nice to meet you. I'm Peggy. We're huggers around here. The older woman wrapped her in her arms. Summer had to lean down to return her embrace, enjoying the moment of comfort. Peggy stepped back, holding Summer by the shoulders. Unlike just about everybody else in the room, Peggy wasn't tall, maybe 5'4", and just the other side of plump. She had short blonde hair and a cheerful smile. Well, aren't you lovely? You look a little like your cousin, but he didn't get that pretty blonde hair. Thank you. She held out the bag, hoping it hadn't been jostled too much on the ride. For you. Peggy opened it, pulled out the gift, and lifted it high like a prize. Cookies! A small cheer rose from the crowd, and Summer blushed. 3 oversized men, she recognized Brian, all with brown hair, regarded her, the other 2 smirking as if they didn't quite buy that partner bit. There was also an older couple standing beside Maria, a woman and 2 teenagers. Brian lifted his hand. Glad you're here. Hi. She felt her cheeks burning. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She didn't love it. Grant said, "First, these are my grandparents, Tom and Susie Wright." She stepped forward and shook their hands. Pleasure. Though Tom was very thin and a little stooped, he was still nearly as tall as Summer. Like the rest of the crowd, he had a warm smile. Susie's hands were freezing when she gripped Summer's. "So, you and my grandson then?" "Oh no, we're just partners and friends." The woman frowned, her blue eyes flitting from Summer to Grant. "Mm-hmm. You could do worse." "I'm sure, Grant cleared his throat, saving her having to finish the sentence. "Okay, oldest to youngest brothers. That's Michael." The only one as tall as Grant stepped forward and shook her hand. "Glad to meet you." "And Sam, he's next up from me." This was the one who'd bet against Grant showing up. "You play ping pong like your cousin?" "Used to," she said. "Let's have a game later, just for fun." Grant leaned down and stage whispered, "If you knock him off his high horse, I'll owe you for life." "Challenge accepted." Grant grinned, and Sam laughed. "I'll feel bad about beating a woman, but—" Grant shoved him, knocking him backward, but Sam righted himself. "Watch yourself, kid." Kid? Approaching the only other woman in the room, a brunette with bright blue eyes, Grant held out his arms. When she stepped into them, he gave her a hug. "It's so good to see you." She stayed enveloped in his arms a long time before stepping away. She wiped her eyes quickly, then turned to Summer. "I'm Camilla, nice to meet you." They shook hands. "It's a pleasure." Camilla gestured to the two teens who'd hung back. "Jeremy and Zoe." The kids waved, and then Peggy said, "Grant, she'll stay in the blue room. We're eating in an hour." "Okay." Grant scooped up the two bags and lowered his voice. "The worst is over. Come on." They skirted the crowd to an open staircase and climbed to the second floor. It was quieter up there, though the murmur of voices carried on the hardwood floors. "I feel bad taking up a bedroom. I can sleep on a sofa or—" "There's plenty of room." Grant walked down a hallway lined on both sides with doors, most of which were closed. At the second on the right, he stepped in and dropped his bag on a twin bed. The other bed already had somebody's bag on it. "Michael's," Grant said. "We usually share." Back in the hall, he continued to the end and pushed open a door on his left. "Here you go." She stepped into a room painted a soft blue with a white bureau, two twin beds, the extra long kind she was happy to see, both covered with blue and white quilts. The back wall was all windows. Grant set her duffel on the closer of the two beds. "You can close those curtains if you want." She crossed and looked out at the expanse of ocean. "Wow, this is—" She turned to face him. "Why do you call it a camp?" "It was when Dad first bought the property. The first time we came, we slept in tents. He started building the house when I was about 6. It wasn't like this, though. It was nothing but a cold basement at first. Then, we built the main floor. It took us 10, 15 years to get it from the camp to this." "Us?" Summer sat on the bed. "You guys did the work?" "We all did. When I was 10, I helped tile that bath." He nodded toward a doorway on one side of the room. "That's shared, by the way. I assume Camilla and Zoe are in the adjoining room." "You laid tile when you were 10? "Daniel did most of the laying. Dad worked the wet saw in the basement. My job was to run up and down the steps. But I laid a couple of the tiles. Daniel taught me how. We finished the basement when I was in high school, and by then, I was the one laying the tile." "I didn't know you were so handy." "Not that we had a choice. We painted, installed light fixtures, laid hardwood." He tapped the floor beneath his feet. "We all did our part." "It's amazing." "Mom and Dad's vision. They have a plan to build cabins around the place. I think they figured we'd all have wives and kids by now." "But only Daniel?" "Yeah, he married pretty young, right out of college. But the first time we met Camilla, we knew she was the woman for him. They were—" His words faded, and he cleared his throat. "Anyway, hang out here or come down, whatever. I'll be downstairs with the guys." He closed her door, leaving her alone. She dug into her bag, pulled out her toiletries, and stepped into the bathroom. Thanks to the wild ride out there, her hair was a mess. She was yanking a brush through it when she heard rustling from the room next door. There was a knock on the adjoining bathroom door. Summer swung it open to find Zoe on the opposite side. "Oh, sorry," the girl said. "No problem. I'll get out of your way. I was just going to plug this in." She lifted a curling iron and shoved the plug into the outlet. "I thought I'd try curling my hair. Give me something to do. The Wi-Fi is terrible, and there's nobody to talk to. I mean, don't get me wrong. They're my family, and they're nice and everything." Her cheeks turned pink. "What do you have in common with a bunch of unmarried men?" Zoe seemed relieved. "Exactly. And everybody looks at us with these pitying. Anyway, no rush." It was a big bathroom with double sinks. "You can come in. I'm almost done." Summer felt for the girl. At least Jeremy had his gender in common with his uncles. This girl seemed as out of place as Summer. "How old are you?" 20. "Oh, I didn't realize." She wasn't a kid at all. "You go to college?" "In Oklahoma, near home. I didn't want to leave Mom and Jeremy." "I'm sorry about your father." "Thanks." She grabbed her own hairbrush from a drawer and started brushing. She had long, straight brown hair, the same color as her uncle's, but aside from the brown eyes, she looked like her mother. Pale skin, high cheekbones. Summer finished brushing, and they chatted about nothing while Zoe curled her hair. After 10 minutes, the long locks were wavy and beautiful. "Impressive." "Thanks." Zoe ran her fingers through the curls, then gave Summer a sidelong glance. "Your hair is gorgeous." "Not as pretty as yours. It's so shiny." "You wouldn't let me," Zoe lifted the iron, "practice, would you?" "Oh, the girl's expression fell. "It's fine. I'm just—" "Sure." She didn't know where the word came from, but it popped out of her mouth. And what did Summer care? It gave her a good excuse to hang out upstairs and avoid the chaos for a few more minutes. She loved the idea of a big family, but she wasn't sure of her place or how she fit in. Zoe disappeared into the bedroom and came back with a chair. "You'll need to sit, or I won't be able to reach it." Unlike the rest of the Wright clan, Zoe wasn't that tall, maybe 5'5". Summer sat, and Zoe started expertly wrapping Summer's hair around the wand. It had been a long time since anybody had done Summer's hair. Most girls would probably remember times with their sisters, but she, Crystal, and Misty had never had the do-each-other's hair kind of relationship. Instead, Summer remembered photo shoots and models she used to know. Women who were comfortable in their own skin, comfortable with their femininity. Summer missed those days, back when she thought the scariest man in the world was her father. Since then, she'd met worse. But while Zoe chatted and curled her hair, and then applied some of her own makeup to Summer's, because come on, you might as well look fabulous as long as you have to endure this family. Summer remembered how much she used to love being female, before Ramon and his henchmen had scared the girl right out of her.
Chapter 18. Whoa! Grant and Sam had been catching up by the fireplace. At Sam's tone, Grant followed his gaze. Zoe was coming downstairs, but as pretty as their niece was, Sam wasn't staring at her. Summer was 2 steps behind Zoe. Her hair was wavy, framing her face, and if he wasn't mistaken, she'd applied makeup. He'd never seen Summer in makeup, as if she hadn't already been gorgeous. Sam leaned close to Grant. "So, are you and her, It would be one thing to lose his shot with Summer because Brian wanted to pursue her. Brian was a good guy, steady and trustworthy, and Grant owed him big time. But Sam? Grant loved his older brother, but he'd never been impressed with how he treated women, like they were disposable. "I will literally kill you." Grant didn't bother to soften his words with a smile. "Unlike when we were kids, I can take you without breaking a sweat." Sam tore his gaze away from Summer, who'd reached the landing and was talking to Camilla. He gave Grant an amused, appraising look. "I see. She's my partner and my best friend's cousin. Not that she'd give you a second glance. She's got a top-notch BS detector. Sam's smile faded. You don't know me, Grant. Keep your thoughts to yourself. He turned and headed back toward the kitchen. Grant felt a twinge of guilt, but tamped it down and approached Summer, who glanced his way. You clean up nice. She ran a hand over her curled hair. Zoe did it. If he wasn't mistaken, he would swear Summer's cheeks turned pink. We had some girl time. He forced his gaze to his niece. Nicely done. How's school? While Zoe told him about her classes, Summer headed for the kitchen, where Mom promptly put her to work arranging steaming dishes on the granite countertop. Grant forced himself to focus on his niece and sister-in-law, though he found his gaze straying towards Summer often. The meal was a typical Wright affair, all of them gathered around the long dining room table, talking over each other, the brothers telling stories, mostly about Grant, since he'd been dumb enough to bring a guest, though he caught his mother giving Maria looks often enough. She lived in the house closest to their property when they were kids, the veritable girl next door. Grant hardly knew her, but she and Brian had been in the same grade. Now they sat beside each other talking, though neither seemed pleased. If Mom was hoping to spark romance on that front, she'd missed the mark. He'd wanted to sit beside Summer, but he'd been intercepted before he could make his way to her, and the chairs around her were taken, Sam on one side, Zoe on the other. Brian sat across from her, leaving Grant to watch from the other end of the table. He'd always known Summer would get along with his family. He'd always known she'd fit in with this crew as if she were one of them. He caught her eye and she smiled at him, and his heart did that pancake flipping thing again. You got it bad. He turned to Derek, seated across from him. Rather than lie, he twirled some spaghetti and forked a meatball, then shoved the bite into his mouth. Derek laughed. Does she know? He swallowed the food, shook his head, and lowered his voice. She spooks easily. After a long look in Summer's direction, Derek leaned in. She looks pretty tough to me. Usually he'd agree, but tonight Summer reminded him of the model she'd been for years. Gorgeous, an all-girl. He loved the woman he'd trained to be a bodyguard, the tough-as-nails woman he worked with, but the pretty, smiling woman at the other end of the table made his heart swell. While most of the crew cleared the table, Dad roped Grant and Jeremy into helping outside. Grant cast one last gaze at Summer, who'd planted herself at the sink and was happily washing dishes, and followed his dad and his nephew out the back door into the pitch-black night. The sounds of the party faded as they made their way down the steps from the covered deck. Following the bouncing beams of flashlights, they crossed to the far edge of the lawn, where a pile of sticks waited. He get enough kindling? Grant asked. Dad nodded. And replenish the supply, so we'll be ready next time. He held out a long lighter to Jeremy. You want to do the honors? 16-year-old Jeremy took it, eyes wide. Sure. He walked toward the pile. Where do I... Dad showed Jeremy where to light the bonfire, teaching him, like he taught all the boys, not just how to get it going, but also how to keep it safe. As much rain as they'd gotten lately, with the sodden grass that had probably still had snow on it a month earlier, there was little chance of starting a forest fire, but Dad never missed an opportunity to pass on knowledge to his sons, and now his grandson. Grant watched the teen, so like his father, feeling the sting of grief that hit whenever he thought of Daniel. How could his oldest brother be gone? Daniel would have loved Summer. Grant could imagine that crooked smile, his big, warm hand on Grant's shoulder. He'd say, "Good choice, bro," and he'd tell him to be brave. Be honest. Grant needed to heed that advice. There'd never be a better time than now to confess his feelings to Summer. If she rejected him, then he'd move on, or fight for her. But he couldn't continue this limbo living anymore. The fire caught. Jeremy and Dad stepped back, and the three of them watched as the flames rose first from the smallest pieces, then to the dry kindling until the big branches lit. Wow, Jeremy stared. Awesome. Dad backed up to stand beside Grant. Glad you're with us, son. Yeah, me too. They watched the flames grow for a few minutes in silence. Using a big stick, Jeremy poked the fire, trying to get more of it to light. You need to stop avoiding us, Dad said. It's not necessary. Grant's overfull stomach churned. Brian has every right to hold a grudge against me. Does he? You know what happened. Hold a grudge, I mean. Dad didn't look away from the flickering light. I think it's time you two had a real conversation. Stop dancing around it. There's nothing to say. Dad gripped his shoulder. The only person who's still angry with you is you. It's time to move on, son. It's time to be a part of this family again. The door opened and the rest of his family spilled outside, their chattering voices saving Grant from responding. Dad squeezed his shoulder and leaned in. By the way, I like her. Oh, she's, Still reeling from Dad's last words, Grant couldn't think of what to say. I get it. Trust me, I get it. Dad patted him on the back, then moved to join the crowd as they reached the lawn. Grant stood there staring after him stupidly until Summer approached and held out a cookie. Chocolate macadamia nut. My favorite. He took it and she smiled. Your family is amazing. I love them all. He watched as they gathered around the bonfire, munching cookies. He was sure his mother had a different dessert planned for tonight, but she'd served the cookies to make Summer feel special. That was the kind of person Mom was, the kind of people they all were. This bonfire, this was the kind of people they were. Every time they gathered at camp, unless it was pouring rain, they had a bonfire. After this, they'd go inside and play games and tell stories and laugh. This house didn't even have a TV. Nobody cared to watch anything, not when they were together. He loved that. He loved being here and sharing it with Summer. This is my dream, to have a family like this. Her tone was wistful. The breeze kicked up, blowing her pretty curled hair into her face. She shook it away, crossing her arms. He wandered to the far side of the bonfire, and she followed him, away from the crowd. Their voices were muffled by the crackling fire, the breeze, and the surf below. What's your family like? She held her gloved hands out toward the flickering flames. Their light danced on her skin, in her eyes, and he found himself mesmerized. My mom was sweet and gentle. She was no match for my father. Her voice took on a hard quality. Did he hurt you? Once. I was just a kid, and he was drunk, and he grabbed me, hard, shook me, but I didn't know the rules. I was supposed to cower, apparently. I was supposed to cry and do what he told me. I didn't. I kicked him in the knee. He could picture the woman in front of him standing up to an angry man, but she'd been a little girl whose father should have protected her, not hurt her. Served him right. Her head dipped, lifted again. I ran to my mom. She and Crystal were in the kitchen. Misty was there, sitting at the table, looking up at me with those wide eyes. I told Mom what happened. I thought she'd defend me or protect me or something, but she looked more afraid than I was. I tried to get her and Crystal to run away with me. We could go to John's house. I thought we'd be safe there. I never knew he did that, you know? I'd never seen him I'd heard fighting, of course, but I'd never realized. Grant waited a few beats, giving her time to finish her story, but she just stared into the bonfire. What happened? Summer shrugged. Mom looked at my arm and said it seemed fine. Dad was yelling for her in the other room, and she started for the door. I grabbed her, begged her not to go, but she patted my head and told me it would be better, that she could calm him down. And then she walked in there. He was yelling. She was whimpering. And Crystal, she went back to setting the table, as if it were all normal. But I knew it wasn't normal. I knew it wasn't okay. I tried to get Crystal to come with me, but she said no. We had to stay. We'd get in trouble if we left. Well, I didn't care. I wasn't going to let my father treat me that way. So I picked Misty up and I marched out. I carried my sister down to John's house. They lived a couple of streets over. I told Uncle Marshall and Aunt Sally what happened. Uncle Marshall called the police. Good. At least somebody had half a brain. Did your father get arrested? Summer shook her head. Dad told the police it was an accident, and Mom backed him up. Oh man, what kind of mother? I'm sorry, she shrugged. Dad never laid a hand on me again, and I kept a close watch on my little sister. I wasn't going to let him hurt her, but Mom and Crystal. Her voice faded, and she said nothing for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice was hard. They shouldn't have put up with it. Mom shouldn't have made excuses for him. Crystal walked on eggshells all the time. trying to keep the peace. Why? Why did he deserve that? Not me, though. I spent half my childhood at John's house, and I took Misty with me whenever Mom would let me. If she and Crystal were stupid enough to put up with him, that was their problem. A pretty callous attitude for a little girl. I hate that you had to deal with that. I learned pretty early on that nobody was going to protect me but me, and if I wanted my little sister to be safe, that was up to me too. She'd learned more than that. She'd learned that the only way to be safe was to be tough, to never back down. It explained a lot. Your mother should have protected you, Grant said. One might argue that John and his family did what she couldn't. Summer's eyes narrowed, though she didn't look away from the bonfire. I guess. You were wise to seek their protection. I just needed to get away. They weren't protecting me. Weren't they? She blinked. I never thought of it that way. I just thought of their house as a safe place. They did protect you, though, and you were smart to seek it, from your mother, and when she didn't step up, from John's family. There's nothing wrong with admitting you're not strong enough to take on the world. We all need help sometimes. I'm not very good at that. No kidding. He infused his sarcasm with humor. Her lips tipped up at the corners. He turned to look at the flames, heart pounding. Because he needed to tell her how he felt. Would she accept it, or would she push him away? He took a deep breath and turned to her again. I need to tell you, you're amazing, he faltered, incredibly courageous. I don't know any other woman who'd have the nerve to stand up to an abusive man, her father, like that. Sometimes I think I was just stupid. I mean, not to stand up to him, but to expect my mother to have my back. She was a good woman, but she didn't have it in her. Over the years, she seemed to shrink. It almost felt like a foregone conclusion when she got cancer. She'd been wasting away. It's probably wrong of me to blame my father for her death, but I do. I think if she'd been happy, if she'd been able to thrive, maybe she could have fought it. As it was almost as if, when she got diagnosed, she felt relieved, like she looked forward to being free of him. I'm sorry, Summer. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. But look what an amazing woman you turned out to be. Strong and brave and beautiful. She dipped her face as if she were suddenly bashful. Oh man, that look. Laughter carried from the other side of the bonfire. Brian punched Michael lightly, and Mike stumbled back, exaggerating the movement. Maria stood with his grandparents, but her eyes were on the brothers. More laughter erupted. What happened between you and Brian? Summer faced him, her head tilting to one side. She'd told him her story. If he wanted to tell her how he felt, if he hoped she might return his feelings, she needed to know him, even the ugliest thing about him. Come on! He took her gloved hand in his, only realizing after he did it what he'd done. But Summer didn't yank it away as they walked. Where are we going? He didn't answer until they reached the stone wall that surrounded the property. He nodded out toward the ocean. They were only 20 yards or so from the bonfire, but the wind blew off the Atlantic, stealing the fire's warmth and swallowing up the laughter. You remember the cliff wall as we approached? She nodded, looking down at the waves that crashed below. Dad, Sam, and Michael were laying hardwood upstairs. I was 9. I was supposed to be keeping an eye on Brian. We weren't allowed to go down to the water by ourselves, but I'd been itching to show off. See, I'd been secretly climbing up the cliff. You climbed that? It's not as steep as it looks. There are plenty of handholds. It wasn't that hard. By her wide eyes, Summer disagreed. She'd always seemed so tough, but as he was getting to know her better, he realized she had fears, just like everybody else. Here was a woman who'd followed a terrorist alone into a parking garage, but she was afraid of boats and didn't seem inclined to climb a rocky slope. Brian didn't want to get in trouble, but I talked him into going down the steps with me. I told him to stay on the dock and watch. I wanted to show off. It was hard to see Summer's face in the darkness. He was glad he didn't have to watch her reaction. Glad, too, that she couldn't see his face. I was a lot shorter then, and the climb was hard. I had to really focus. But I did it. When I got to the top, I lifted my arms in triumph, figuring Brian would be impressed. But he wasn't there. Oh no! I was sure he'd fallen into the water and was drowning. I screamed his name. He shook his head to clear the memories. I bolted down the steps, got to the bottom. That's when I saw him. He decided to follow me. He was halfway up the cliff, stuck. I tried to help him, but Grant could still see his little brother, his tiny body pressing against the rocks, calling for help, afraid to go farther up, unable to go down. I ran back up the stairs and got my dad. He grabbed a rope, but by the time we got back, he took a breath, blew it out. He'd fallen, landed on the jagged rocks below. Dad had one of those old radios, and he managed to call for help. A helicopter came and took Brian away. Both legs were broken. One of them never healed right. The limp, Summer said. My fault. I never should have left him. I should have called my dad before I ran down there. I should have stayed with Brian, not run away. If I hadn't left him, he wouldn't have fallen. You don't know that. I know he was scared. Grant could still see his little brother's body, crumpled on the rocks. He'd been sure he was dead. Dad had barreled past him, screaming Brian's name as he descended the steep metal staircase. When Grant closed his eyes, he could still hear the anguish in his father's voice. He was all alone, in pain. Because you'd gone for help, Summer said. Grant should have been with him. He should never have left him. You've never forgiven yourself. Her voice held certainty. Should I? Brian used to dream of playing football. He was good too. He was what, 7? I'm just saying he might have had a future. He was a fast runner. He was quick. There are lots of things he never got to do because of me, and he never let me forget it either. As he recovered, and then over the years, he'd mention it often, how he followed me, how he should never have been there, wouldn't have been if not for me. That's why I left. The rest of my brothers went off to college, but that wasn't far enough away for me. I joined the army. I figured they were all happy to have me gone. Summer watched him a long moment. It doesn't seem that way. Your family couldn't be more welcoming, and Brian obviously doesn't hold a grudge against you. I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say he wants to make things right. You think so? Grant had hoped the same thing. Summer squeezed his hand, then reached out and took the other one. Maybe you two should try to find a minute to talk about it, away from the crowd. Because, I don't know. I think maybe this is the time to put it behind you. Exactly what Dad had said. Would it be possible to move past it? Could Brian really forgive him? Summer still held both his hands, and all thoughts of his brother blew away on the breeze. Summer, I have a confession to make. He blocked what little light came from the bonfire, shrouding her in darkness. What's that? Her words were a little breathless. I don't always only think of you as a partner. Way to wimp out. But was she really ready to hear he was in love with her? Oh, I don't always only think of you as a partner either. Which seemed obvious, come to think of it. They were holding hands after all. He didn't want to ruin their working relationship, but he didn't want a working relationship with her anymore. He wanted so much more. He wanted to give her so much more. More than his protection, more than his friendship. That wasn't a very honest confession on my part. She said nothing. He thought maybe her eyebrows lifted, but it was too dark to know for sure. The truth is, though he'd like to see her face, maybe this would be better said in the dark. Maybe if she responded with horror or revulsion, he didn't want to know. I have feelings for you. I have had for some time. Oh, and I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable, and maybe this wasn't the time to tell you, but I can't imagine there'll ever be a better time. And I just told you the worst thing I ever did, and you didn't toss me over the cliff, so maybe... She chuckled, the sound low and amused. Do you always babble when you're nervous? Probably. A long moment of silence passed, and then she squeezed his hands. I don't know if you noticed, but I'm still standing here. I noticed. His voice was rough. He was afraid to let go of her hands, afraid she'd bolt, but she didn't seem inclined to run away. He let go, placed one hand on her hip. Her palm slid against his jacket, and he wished he'd gone without it. He'd be freezing, but he'd take the cold wind if it meant feeling her warmth against his skin. He wrapped his other arm around her back, closing the distance between them. Lowered his head. His lips found hers, and he kissed her, softly, gently. giving her the opportunity to push him away. But she didn't. She pressed closer. Her hand slid around his neck, her fingers warmed through the gloves, and though he warned himself to go slowly, he couldn't help the way he deepened the kiss. When she opened up to him, he nearly exploded with desire. The sound of the surf, his family's distant laughter, the cold wind, everything faded away except the feel of summer in his arms, her lips moving against his own. For the first time since they'd arrived at his family's camp, maybe for the first time since the day his brother had fallen from that cliff, Grant felt like he'd come home.
Chapter 19. What in the world had Summer been thinking? She hugged the borrowed bathrobe closer as she paced to the window overlooking the sea the next morning, calling herself all sorts of idiot. She'd let Grant kiss her. Worse than that, she'd kissed him back. She hadn't been kissed since a neighbor had invited her to a New Year's Eve party back in New York, just as friends. But by midnight, he decided he wasn't content with the friends part of the deal. When his lips had touched hers, she'd felt nothing but frustrated at the guy for not being honest, and at herself for worrying about hurting his feelings, as if she owed him something. Between her father, male models who thought they were all that, and a piece of cake, and fawning, pawing men she'd met in New York, and since, she'd decided years before that she wasn't ever going to fall in love. But somehow, Grant had slipped past all her defenses. Not that she loved him, just that she could see her feelings going there if she let her guard down. The memory of the moment the night before made her face burn as if she were standing too close to the bonfire, not in her bedroom, staring out at the rough water of the Atlantic. Water she'd have to cross again, with Grant. This was a nightmare, made worse by the fact that, along with her typical bad dreams, she'd had a good one. About Grant. About his lips moving against hers. About being wrapped in his arms, feeling safe and secure. The thought brought a shiver of pleasure, which she shook off. She'd spent an hour with the Lord that morning, trying to figure out what she should do. But she'd gotten no good answer, certainly not from reading her Bible on her phone app. She'd been slowly working through the New Testament, and today's reading happened to be in the book of 1 John. Perfect love casts out fear. Bad timing, that. Maybe God's perfect love did cast out fear. In Summer's life, love was scarier than all the boat rides and smugglers and kidnappers in the world. Not that she was in love with Grant. No way. As far as she could tell, Grant was good and kind and noble. If she ever was going to fall in love, he'd be a decent choice. Maybe. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Who knew what a person was really like? Dad had probably seemed like a good, kind, noble guy, too, when Mom had met him. Loving someone meant opening up to him, being vulnerable, and she wasn't climbing on that crazy train. She turned away from the view and dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. Her hair was still wet from her shower, but she yanked it back in a bun. She certainly wouldn't be curling it, and there'd be no makeup. All that dressing up had put her in the wrong frame of mind, made her feel feminine and pretty. It made her lower her guard. She needed to get off this island. She needed to focus on the job at hand. It was 9 o'clock, only 6 in LA. Too early to call John. She hoped, prayed, he'd have a lead for them. They needed to bring Ramon down so she could return to her job and her boring, predictable life. She'd been awake for hours, but hadn't ventured out of her room, too embarrassed to face Grant and his family. They'd teased Grant about the kiss when they thought she wasn't looking. She had no idea how anybody had seen it, but someone had been watching. Spying, more like. She'd played it like it didn't matter. Running to her room would have made the already awkward situation worse. So she'd held his hand and rejoined the party, smiling and laughing as if her nerves weren't trembling, as if she weren't burning with shame. When the fire had died down, she'd gone inside with the rest of them and played ping pong, besting Sam 2 out of 3. Maybe she'd been a little aggressive. Maybe she'd been eager to show herself superior to the brother who'd bet against Grant. Maybe she'd wanted to prove she wasn't some weak-kneed damsel just because she'd let a guy kiss her. Just because she'd enjoyed it. A lot. A knock sounded at her door, and she spun as if preparing to face an enemy. "Summer!" Grant's voice was low. "You awake?" She took a deep breath for courage, plastered on a smile, and opened the door. He was standing on the far side, dressed just like her, jeans and a sweatshirt, looking gorgeous as a smile spread across his face. "Good morning." "Hey." Her cheeks heated. She turned away and started shoving clothes in her duffel bag. "You sleep okay?" "Uh-huh." She stalked into the bathroom and gathered her toiletries. "We leaving soon?" She returned to the bedroom to find him leaning against her door jamb. His smile faded. "In a hurry?" "John'll have an address for us today." "Yup. We're a long way from civilization. I figured we should get moving." "Huh." She zipped the bag and looked up. He stood there like he hadn't a care in the world. "What?" "You don't have anything to be embarrassed about." "Why would I be embarrassed?" "I'm the one who confessed my feelings. All you did was kiss me back." "I don't want to talk about that." "Well, I do. I very much want to talk about it. Because I confessed my feelings to you. And I'd like to know where I stand. Right now, you're standing in my bedroom, and I don't like it." His expression hardened. He took a purposeful step back. Then another. "Better?" he asked from the opposite side of the hallway. "Not at all. Because there could be people out there, listening. Let's just—" She walked to the door and grabbed the knob. "We'll talk later." She started to close it, but he stepped across the hall again and shoved his foot in the space. "Mom wanted me to invite you down for breakfast. I'll keep my distance." He swiveled and walked away, then disappeared down the stairs at the end of the hall. Well, that couldn't have gone worse. Summer didn't want to socialize, but she also didn't want to be rude to Grant's family. She definitely didn't want anybody thinking she was embarrassed or whatever. She needed to prove she hadn't been affected by that stupid kiss. She slipped on her sneakers. As she descended the stairs, the scents of a wood fire mingled with those of bacon and toast. It smelled like morning should. Grant sat at the dining room table with Derek, Brian, Roger, and Jeremy. He didn't even glance up. In the kitchen, Summer took a spoonful of breakfast casserole and a buttered English muffin and joined Peggy, Camilla, and Zoe at the round table. The grandparents and Maria weren't around. Within a couple of minutes, Summer had forgotten her embarrassment and joined their conversation, feeling at home and comfortable despite the circumstances. She'd give anything to have a family like this. Except that obviously wasn't true. Because maybe, if she opened herself up to Grant, she could have not just a family like this, but this actual one. What would that be like? She could imagine them decorating a Christmas tree, ripping open packages. She could imagine them setting off fireworks on the 4th of July, the bonfire flickering in the background. And, God help her, she could imagine herself snuggled up at Grant's side, feeling at home, feeling safe. But to get there, she'd have to get past a whole lot of baggage. It was one thing to count on Grant as a work partner, to count on him to have her back, but to open herself up to him, to trust him with her emotions. No, she couldn't do it. She wouldn't weaken herself with Grant the way her mother had weakened herself with her dad. When they'd first fallen in love, Mom had trusted Dad. She'd believed in him, and he'd betrayed her in the worst way. He'd gone from being her protector to being the man she'd needed protection from. Summer would never take that risk. Never. And Grant deserved a woman who could love him back. She was too damaged to be that woman. "What are you two up to today?" Peggy asked. "We've got some business." The older woman's eyes lit. "A client? Someone famous? Grant told me you guarded Denise Masters a few months back." Zoe's eyes lit. "No kidding? What's she like?" "She's down to earth, kind and generous and humble." Summer leaned in and lowered her voice. "John, my cousin, he's dating her." "Whoa!" Zoe's jaw dropped. "That's so cool. Is it like a big secret?" "Not at all. They're very serious. John's traveling with her now. I'll be surprised. And this is a secret. But I'll be surprised if he doesn't propose in the next couple of months." Peggy smiled wide. "That's great news. I hope they'll be very happy together." Her gaze scanned the men gathered at the table on the opposite side of the great room. I wish my boys would settle down. Ridiculous, they're all still single. She reached across the table and squeezed Camilla's hand. Daniel was the wisest of them, snatching you up before you got away. Camilla gave her a fond smile. I'm so glad we came. I've missed you. She shifted her gaze to Summer. And I'm glad we got to meet you. It's been nice to get to know you. All of you. Summer braced herself for some comment about her and Grant, but Camilla returned her attention to her breakfast, and Peggy turned to Zoe, asking about her part-time job. Summer's phone buzzed in her pocket, a message from John. Got an address. This could be it. Thank you for breakfast. It was delicious. She stood and cleared her dishes. Then she got Grant's attention across the room, lifting her phone. He gave her a nod and returned his focus to his family. Fine then. He'd be ready when he was ready. She climbed the stairs to her room and, using an internet service, dialed John. What did you learn? She asked. Where's Grant? Busy. You're at camp? Why does everybody call it that? She snapped. There's nothing camp-like about it. Wake up on the wrong side of the sleeping bag? She scowled. Could you give me the information, please? John chuckled, which just annoyed her further. Beverly Bannister owns a house in York. According to satellite images, it's got a private dock. Is it pretty secluded? Seems like it. You'll have to check it out to know for sure. Address? He told her. She tapped it into her phone, then clicked on it to see where it was. And groaned. It's over 2 hours from here. You're in the middle of nowhere, John said. Whatever Ramon is smuggling, York would be a good place to offload. It's not far from I-95. It's only an hour from Boston, less than an hour from Manchester, not far from Portland. I don't know where they're distributing them, but I'll let Grant know. Keep me informed, and don't hesitate to call in the team if you need backup. There's no shame asking for help. Got it. She ended the call, not in the mood for one of John's lectures. A knock sounded on the door. Can I come in? Grant again. Sure. He pushed open the door and stood in the opening. John? He has an address for us. Okay, I'll tell Dad. You're ready? She nodded, words clogging her throat. Because, as much as she'd acted like she wanted off that island, she didn't really want to leave. Fine. Grant pulled the door closed without a word. The day before, they'd had an easy working relationship. They'd talked and laughed and shared stories. Now, all that was gone. That stupid kiss had ruined everything.
Chapter 20. Grant couldn't decide who he was angrier with, Summer or himself. He should have kept his stupid mouth shut, and his hands and lips to himself. When they'd left the house under cloudy skies, Summer had offered thanks and hugs to his family, nice as could be. But when he'd sat beside her on the boat, she'd shifted as far from him as she could get without moving to a different bench. He figured the only reason she hadn't was because his dad was there. Never mind that her fists were clenched, her skin pale with fear. He could have offered her a blanket but didn't. If she'd rather suffer alone than let him offer his warmth and comfort, so be it. At the marina, she'd hug Grant's father goodbye while remaining politely distant from Grant. The wind had freed her hair from the bun, and she yanked it out, let it fall around her face, but the soft look didn't reach her eyes. Her politeness faded as they'd walked to the car. He hadn't turned on music, hoping they could talk, but considering he'd already tried to discuss what happened once, the ball was in her court. Apparently, she had no plan to hit it back. An hour and a half along a narrow highway, and she'd said not a single word. They hit Brunswick and angled onto the interstate in silence. By the time they were passing the exit leading to Kennebunk, he was fuming. This is ridiculous. He hadn't meant to speak, but he couldn't stand it anymore. Are we seriously not going to talk about what happened? There's nothing to talk about. Her voice was cold, detached. We got caught up in the moment. The meal, the fire. It was unprofessional. He'd confessed his feelings and she was calling him unprofessional. We weren't at work, Summer. Call me Lake. No. He could feel her glare but didn't bother looking her direction. He wasn't going to pretend nothing had happened. That kiss. It had been more than a meeting of lips. It had proved to him, as if he hadn't already known to the depth of his being, that they were meant to be together. She was the woman for him. He was the man for her. And there was no chance he was letting her off the hook. She'd need to face it, deal with it. If she wanted to end their friendship, fine. This was going to be the beginning of them. Or once Rahman was behind bars, it was going to be the end. Just no? Her calm demeanor cracked. I'm not going backwards, Summer. I'm no longer going to pretend that I don't know you, that I don't have feelings for you. If that makes you uncomfortable, then that's your problem. He angled off the highway toward York, eager to get where they were going. You have no right. This isn't about rights. It was about the fact that he loved her, and she obviously didn't love him back. Even if she had returned his kiss, fervently, even if she had held his hand and looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not just a smile, but pure pleasure, as if she loved being there as much as he'd loved having her, as if the kiss meant something to her. Or maybe the flickering firelight had made him see things that weren't there. He followed the directions on his cell screen. It was Saturday morning, which meant light traffic. He turned down a road that led through the center of town, passing churches with tall white steeples and shops with cedar shake siding. Parking lots packed with cars beside little mom-and-pop restaurants. Overflowing window boxes and freshly planted flower beds bursting with color. But cold spring air was blowing. Like summer, it looked pretty until you got up close. Then you felt the chill. Except in his arms the night before, she'd been plenty warm. Stop the car! Her words were abrupt. She took a deep breath and started again. Please, pull over for a second. It was pure stubbornness on his part that tempted him to keep driving. But if she wanted to say something, then he wanted to hear it. He angled into the lot of a small office park and stopped. What? I'm being unreasonable. No kidding. Her eyebrows lifted over those stormy gray eyes. You're usually more gracious. Yeah, well, he was annoyed. No, furious. Furious was the word. I'm sorry. For a second, he thought that would be the end of it. But then she continued. I just don't know how I'm supposed to act now. I shouldn't have kissed you back. I got caught. Why? Why? What? Why shouldn't you have kissed me back? Because I don't. You said you had feelings for me, and I didn't know how to. How to what? Say no? I've witnessed men hitting on you for years. Clients, friends of clients, even coworkers. And he'd always watched, horrified at first, then amused as she'd shut them down. You've never had any trouble telling them no. This was different. She tipped her head down, her hair falling in front of her face, blocking his view. But a second later, she lifted her gaze. It was you. So, I didn't want to. I was trying not to. He faced forward, closed his eyes. If you say you didn't want to hurt my feelings, well, I didn't. He took a breath. Lord, what am I supposed to do with that? She was lying. He knew she was lying. He faced her again. You kissed me back because you wanted to. Her eyes widened, but she masked the expression fast. You kissed me back because you liked it, and you admitted to me that I'm more than just a partner to you. I thought we were friends. John's my friend, but I've never been tempted to kiss him. That's not. So what if I'm attracted to you? I'm not interested in a relationship. Grant watched her for a long time, trying to discern truth or fiction in her words, but nothing showed in her hard expression. Her lips, usually pretty and naturally pink, were pressed closed and tight at the corners. Her eyes held a challenge, daring him to disagree. When this is over, you can request a different partner. He shifted into drive and headed out of the parking lot. And if I don't want a different partner? You're out of luck, because I'll be looking for a new job. What? She sounded genuinely shocked. You're going to quit? Yup. He watched the map, taking a left on a country road lined with restaurants and hotels. He followed it a half a mile or so, thankful for the quiet he'd cursed for hours. He turned on a road barely wide enough for 2 cars. Tall, spindly trees rose on both sides. He caught sight of the ocean through the woods on his left. Why? Summer's voice was soft, barely audible over the sound of the tires on the gravelly pavement. He could honestly tell her that he hated the job, that he found the work dull and was desperate for something that stimulated his mind. He could honestly tell her about the different companies that had tried to recruit him over the years. He could honestly share his dreams. He didn't have to tell her the real reason, but he did. The only reason I took the job was to be near you. Wait, what? How long? Why would you? Shh, we're almost there. I need to focus. To her credit, she quieted, her gaze skimming their surroundings. They passed the driveway, and he peered through the woods toward the house, checking for security cameras. He didn't see any, but that didn't mean they weren't there. He continued about a quarter-mile to the end of the road and parked. What's the plan? This isn't like the last place. He grabbed his phone and climbed out. Stay here. I'm not some underling. He slammed the door. He guessed she'd follow, but he wanted to check it out first, make sure it was safe. After tucking his sweatshirt so his holstered gun would be easier to grab, he cut through the woods toward the little inlet. If the map was to be believed, they could get a look at the back of the house from here. There was no path, but there was a break in the trees not far ahead. He skirted trunks and climbed over fallen branches and around bushes. The forest ended abruptly at a rocky drop-off that created one wall of a cove. The other wall, maybe 50 yards from him, was steeper and rocky on the top and had no trees for cover. A strong, briny breeze whipped against his jacket. He leaned forward and looked down, guessing he was 40 or 50 feet above the water. But this was a gentler slope than the cliff at his folks' camp. It would be easy to navigate. He couldn't see the property from where he stood, so he climbed down the boulders, careful to check each one before putting his weight on it, heading toward the outer edge of the cove. Though the inlet was calm, the crash of waves breaking on the rocky shore carried from his right. If he followed the land around the bend, he'd get a view of the open ocean. But that wasn't his goal. Sure enough, as he moved to the end of the jut of land, the property came into view. He found a good-sized boulder and crouched behind it. The house had looked big in the satellite image, and from his vantage point, it was impressive. At least twice as big as his folks' camp, 6,000 or 7,000 square feet. It had two wings that stretched from either side of the grand center, the back wall of which was mostly windows. It looked more like a hotel than a personal dwelling. The landscaped yard led to stone steps that descended to a small rocky beach and a long dock. There were no other properties in view. Good place to offload contraband. Summer's voice didn't surprise him. He'd heard her coming. For all her training, she didn't have the stealth he did. He turned to find her standing on a rock above him. Get down. We don't want to be seen. She crouched beside him. You think there's somebody looking? I don't know. Maybe. Could be cameras. Summer was a great bodyguard, but stealth and surveillance were definitely out of her wheelhouse. I want you to stay here. Alert me if you see anything. Staying low, he moved out of sight of the property. What are you going to do? Check out the house. She turned as if to follow. I'm coming with you. I need you to keep an eye out. From here. Why? Her look, eyes squinted, brows lowered, told him she suspected his true motives. Because he needed to protect her. But he didn't say that. Because if somebody comes, I need to know. But if someone drives in, then I'll see. I need eyes on both sides of the house. Can you do that? She seemed like she wanted to argue, but after a brief moment, she nodded. Stay there, out of sight. He nodded to where they'd been hiding. Keep your eyes on the dock, the back of the property. You should hear if a boat comes. Without waiting for a reply, he climbed back up the slope, past the Land Rover. Summer turned it off and pocketed the keys, and jogged through the forest, keeping close to the road. If there were cameras, they'd surely be angled to catch people driving by. Hopefully, nobody would give the black SUV a second glance. Grant was banking on the belief that Ramon wouldn't tell Bannister that their conversation in the parking garage had been overheard. He wouldn't want to spook the guy, so even if Ramon had guessed they were in John's vehicle, and even if someone were monitoring the house's security, both of which he highly doubted, that someone wouldn't know to look for a Land Rover. There were no guarantees, though. Sometimes you just had to take a chance. Approach the house. Kiss the girl. What was life without chances? Maybe this venture would prove less risky and more fruitful than last night's. He slowed as he neared the property, moving through the woods carefully so as not to alert anybody to his presence. He caught sight of the driveway and walked parallel to it, picking his way among the skinny trunks. The ground was damp and marshy, muffling his footsteps. When he had a good view, circle drive, four-car garage on one end, oversized front doors, he crouched behind a tree and watched. A light shone through the narrow windows in the center of the structure, but there were no other lights on in the house. No movement anywhere. If he had to guess, the place was empty. He waited 15 minutes, 20. Nothing changed. Slowly, he made his way to the garage. A door on the side was locked, but he peered through a small window, saw a boat on a trailer, two jet skis on another trailer, and a four-wheeler. He returned to the forest and picked his way around to the back of the house to get a closer look at the dock. Staying in the cover of the forest, he snapped some photos. Then he went back to the front, all the way to the road, and dashed across the driveway before checking out the opposite side of the property. When he reached a spot that had a good view of the dock and the rocky hill where he'd left Summer, he took cover behind one of the bushes that lined the yard and looked for her. Even knowing exactly where she was, he couldn't see her. He sent her a quick text. "You see the house?" "Yes." "You see me?" He inched out from behind the tree. A moment passed, and then she replied, "Yes." Excellent. Her view should be perfect. He was about to jog back to the road when a branch snapped nearby. He crouched, scanned the forest, the yard. It was quiet now, but that noise hadn't been made by a woodland creature. Something big was out here, and he highly doubted it was a bear. Silently, he shifted around the tree so it was between him and where he thought the sound had come from. Waited. There was movement deeper in the woods. Not far, maybe 10, 15 feet away, if his guess was right. Footsteps. Grant inched his handgun out of its holster, prepared to defend himself, shoot if necessary. Had to be a guard. If the guard knew Grant was here, then catching Rahman in the act had just become much, much harder. If Grant ended up showing himself, he didn't want to think about the ramifications. He could be in serious legal trouble. He was trespassing after all. But more importantly, Rahman would know that they'd found the property. It would blow their one opportunity to catch him in the act, to bring him down. Summer would never be safe. The guy was still moving. He wasn't trying to be quiet, which meant he probably had no idea Grant was there. He was getting closer, 5 feet away, 4. Grant could hear him breathing. He stopped on the opposite side of the tree Grant was hiding behind, stayed there a long time. Then he moved along, his footsteps gaining speed. Grant shifted silently around the tree to keep it between them. As the footsteps faded, he chanced a glance. Medium height, dark blonde hair that grew past the collar of his black jacket. Wore black jeans, black boots. The long end of a rifle swung out to the side. Definitely a guard. Maybe he'd seen movement in the forest. Maybe he patrolled the grounds often. Either way, Grant needed to get out of there. Silently, he backtracked to the road and dashed across. Only when he was off the property did he text Summer to meet him at the SUV. "Well?" She was standing beside it, arms crossed, when he emerged from the woods. "Get in." His words were harsh and her eyes flashed. But she did as he asked. He did the same, shifted into gear, but he didn't start driving. "The place is being watched." "What? Did you see somebody? Were you seen?" "I saw a guard. It's possible he saw movement in the woods and went to check it out. It's possible I tripped a wire. It's possible there are cameras, though I didn't see any." "So maybe you were seen." "I don't think so. But if you tripped a wire..." Could have been a deer, a bear, some other large animal. The guy didn't seem nervous, wasn't making much effort to be quiet. I don't think he thought he was in danger. Summer's gaze skimmed the area. "Why are we sitting here? I want that guy to get comfortable again before we move. I don't want him to see us driving away. And there's no other way out." They were a good quarter-mile past the house. Grant doubted that guard would patrol this far. They should be safe here for the time being. "A guard tells us, 'This is the place.' I have no doubt." "Okay, so now what?" After what Rahman's men had done to Summer the previous week, after kidnapping her and all those models, everything in him wanted to take Rahman down himself. Not just take him into custody, but to take him out. But this wasn't a mission. Rahman wasn't a terrorist, an enemy of his country. At least the powers that be in America didn't know he was. Grant couldn't exactly lead a team in, guns blazing. This was Maine, not Afghanistan. And he didn't have a highly trained team of special operatives. He had Summer, and his number one job was to keep her safe, all of which meant he was going to have to put his personal desire on the back burner. He started the Land Rover and shifted into drive. We call Galinsky.
Chapter 21. You've got to be kidding me. Summer winced at the fury in Grant's words. Until today, she'd never heard him speak to anybody with such anger. At least this time, it wasn't directed at her. They were parked in front of the same office building where they'd stopped earlier. The clouds had broken, revealing a sliver of pale blue sky. Grant had already explained to Agent Galinsky what they'd seen at the Bannister property. You might be onto something. The FBI agent's voice sounded just as tired as it had the last time they'd spoken. But I need evidence. By Grant's expression, he was about to let the guy have it. She slipped her hand over his wrist. It was probably the shock that she'd touched him that stifled his words. I told you what I overheard, she said. Now, we've found somebody who owns a house on the coast that has a private dock and an armed guard on the premises. The owner's husband has been suspected of dealing in stolen antiquities. Suspected by who? The FBI agent asked. Not us. The guy's not on our radar. He should be. Grant shifted his arm, and Summer let it go. She adopted a friendly tone. No need to irritate their only law enforcement ally. We were given his name by Kathleen Hopkins, a woman who works for the Museum of Fine Arts. She wrote an article about this, did a lot of research. Galinsky grumbled. She picked up the sound of typing through the phone. Yay, okay, I see who you're talking about. What's her evidence against Bannister? She's not a cop. Grant's dark eyes glowered at the dashboard screen as if Galinsky were standing right there. She doesn't have evidence. Summer added. She said his name kept floating to the top when she was researching the article. Rumors! Galinsky infused his voice with scorn. Innuendo? Maybe whispered accusations by competitors? You really expect me to act on that? We expect you to act on the information Summer overheard, Grant snapped. We expect you— Look, Galinsky said. If I take this to my boss, he's gonna laugh in my face. We can't just stake out the home of a private citizen on a hunch. We need solid evidence. Grant's hands clenched the steering wheel. Summer resisted the urge to touch him again, just to calm him. What do you recommend we do? You think Rahman threatened you, Galinsky said. We've got him under surveillance, but so far he's not gone anywhere but back and forth from his hotel to the hospital. Governor Hidalgo made it through the surgery all right. That's what I hear. Our guys haven't seen Rahman meet with anybody but family. Because of who his sister is, it was virtually impossible for us to get permission to tail him in the first place. Fact is, there's not a whole lot we can do. So, what? Grant asked. Should Lake just change her name, move away, hope he never finds her? I wish there were more we could do, Ms. Lake. We can't arrest the guy. He didn't threaten you himself. He didn't harm you in any way. Grant said, those men might or might not have been working under his orders. Before Summer could react, Grant did. They beat her up. His volume was rising. They tried to kidnap her. They broke into her home. If we find the guys who did that, we'll take them into custody, but there's no proof they're associated with Rahman. They mentioned him by name. Summer was trying to be the reasonable one, since Grant had clearly adopted the opposite role. But her frustration was mounting. Galinsky said, it could have been You think it was a coincidence? Grant's shout bounced off the windows and reverberated in her brain. It doesn't matter what I think, Galinsky yelled back. Don't you get it? I work for the FBI. I'm not. He paused, breathed, lowered his voice. If it were up to me. You think we're right? Summer asked. Off the record, or whatever? Me, personally? Maybe, but my opinion doesn't matter. What if we bring you evidence? Grant's question was met with a long stretch of silence, Finally, Galinsky said, "What do you mean? What if we—" He shifted, not just positions, she guessed, but what he was about to say. "Got photos of him, or his men. What if we got proof? I recommend you don't go anywhere near that house." "Noted," Grant said. "But if we did get evidence, I'd want to see it, yeah. But even photos, without the actual smuggled goods, without stolen artifacts and whatever else. Drugs is my guess," Grant said. Summer still assumed Rahman was transporting people, but she didn't say so because it didn't matter. "If that's what this is, then, look, I'll pass the information along to the DEA. Maybe they'll want to follow up, but you two need to step away, let the professionals handle it." "The professionals like you? Who can't be bothered? I told you. We'll be in touch." Grant mashed the button on the steering wheel, ending the call and muttering under his breath words she'd never heard him use. Before she could think of anything to say, he was dialing his phone again. A moment later, it rang through the speakers. A woman answered. "York Police Department." Grant asked to be put through to a detective. When a different woman took the call, he explained what they suspected was going to happen at that house. The woman actually laughed. Apparently, Beverly Bannister's family was well known in York, had lived there for generations, gave a lot of money to charity. They'd be getting no help from the local police. A conversation with the state police garnered a similar response. It wasn't that they didn't care or didn't believe him. There simply wasn't enough evidence. Beside her, Grant looked ready to chew his way through a steel door. "I wonder if John knows anybody at the Coast Guard. Maybe they'd be interested." "I think we should get something to eat." He shot her a look that could leave a bruise. Opened his mouth to argue, then snapped it shut. "Yeah, okay." She'd worked with him long enough to see the signs of hunger. Though she'd never seen him as angry as he was right now, he was always more short-tempered before lunch. She pointed to a restaurant down the street. "That place has had a steady stream of customers, usually a good sign." He headed that way and found a parking spot quickly. They were seated at a table near the window overlooking the dreary day. The place smelled of greasy hamburgers and fried potatoes, and her stomach growled as she read her menu. She decided what she wanted, then sent John a quick text. When her phone dinged with a response, Grant looked up from his menu, question in his eyes. She read the message. "John doesn't have any contacts with the Coast Guard." "Figures!" Grant returned his attention to the menu. Summer found a phone number for the Coast Guard online and dialed. She told the person who answered that she had a tip and was directed to another person. She was still on hold when she gave the server her order. Finally, someone came on the line. She related all the information they had, answered questions for a few minutes, and then was thanked for the information. "We'll keep our eyes open," the man said. She hung up and told Grant what they'd said. "Another dead end." "Probably." All around them, diners chatted, most seemingly having a good time, smiling, laughing. Overhead, oldies piped through speakers. Across the aisle, a young couple wrestled toddlers in their booth, while a baby in a high chair shoved dry cereal into his mouth. He was adorable, all squishy and messy, focus intent on the little bits of food as he worked to get his chubby little fingers to pick them up. Despite the chaos of their 3 children, the parents never lost their tempers. They seemed happy. A rush of longing had her turning her eyes forward, but Grant was watching the family too, and his expression mirrored all the things she was trying to pretend she didn't feel. He looked at her, then out the window. She hated the tension between them. She hadn't realized how much she'd counted on Grant's friendship until it was gone. Not just his friendship, his kindness, his warmth. All the time she'd worked with him, she'd taken those things for granted. She missed them. She missed him. The real Grant. She'd had enough of this furious imposter. "Look," she said. His gaze snapped to hers. "First, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I can't be who you want me to be." "You're exactly who I want you to be." I'm... She lost her train of thought, trying to make sense of what he'd said. "You know what I mean?" He sipped his water and stared outside again. Maybe Galinsky's right. Maybe we should just forget the whole thing. Very slowly, he turned back to face her. Ramon already kidnapped you once. He tried again the other day. His words were measured and calm, but they hummed with fury like electricity in a power line. He knows who you are and where you live. He knows you overheard his plans. You think he's going to forget the whole thing. I can just… What? What could she do? Leave her job? Sell her stake in the business? Move away? Spend the rest of her life in hiding? No, she couldn't do any of those things. The point is, it's not your problem. She unwrapped the silverware from the paper napkin to give herself an excuse to look away. If you're going to find another job, there's no reason why you shouldn't do that now. The words felt like sand in her mouth. The idea of Grant quitting, of never seeing him again. Her eyes tingled as if she might cry. In front of a man, over a man. She looked up and saw, for the second time in an hour, Grant's face turn bright red. You really think I'm going to leave you to deal with this by yourself? His voice was low and vehement as he leaned toward her. Just because you don't have feelings for me doesn't mean mine just blew away on the wind. Even if I didn't love you. Whoa. What? Surprise skimmed over her skin. Or was it pleasure? Pretend I didn't say that, he snapped. It doesn't matter. The point is, I'm sticking by your side until you're safe. I didn't rescue you 7 years ago. Watch your back ever since, to see you get kidnapped or killed by that guy. So, stop talking. Summer stared at him, trying to rearrange all the words he'd said so they made some sort of sense. Had he had feelings for her since he met her? Did he love her? Their meals were delivered, and though she'd been hungry, now she could barely force down a couple of bites of her sandwich. Grant, undeterred by the bomb he'd just dropped, shoveled food into his mouth. Or maybe he just didn't want to talk. If only she could get John's advice. He'd always been smart and insightful, so much more than herself. Since he'd become a Christian, he'd become even wiser. She needed his counsel. She needed to tell somebody what was going on. Except John was Grant's best friend. Grant probably wouldn't appreciate her spilling all this to him. Unless… Does John know about… She gestured between… What you said? He guessed, some of it. Grant swallowed some of his Coke. I think he suspected for a while. Huh. And obviously, he wasn't against the idea, if he'd left them together. Of course, his priority was Denise now. Even if John were on board, that didn't change how Summer felt. I can't, she started. I don't know how to finish a sentence? Apparently. He set down his oversized burger and wiped his hands on his napkin. I didn't mean to tell you that other thing. And I know I'm acting like a jerk. I'm not mad at you. I'm mad at myself, and I'm sorry I'm taking it out on you. When his gaze met and held hers, something inside her leapt, replacing the fear that had pulsed since she'd woken up. Yesterday, she'd felt attracted to him. Nestled against his side on that tiny boat ride, she'd felt warm and safe, so different from the stark terror she'd experienced as they'd bounced over the waves this morning. She'd liked holding his hand, laughing with him, sharing stories. She'd admitted to herself that she had a crush on him. But it was more than a crush, wasn't it? Maybe she didn't feel the depth of feelings he felt, but there was something there. When he looked at her like he was now, the something flickered like a candle flame. Or a fire in a fireplace. Not a bonfire, but there might be bonfire potential. The mom and dad across the aisle were packing up their things and their children. They looked happy enough, but her parents had looked happy in public. Nobody had known the truth. None of this is your fault, Grant said, pulling her out of her thoughts. I should have told you a long time ago. It's on me that I kept my feelings to myself for 7 years. Surely not 7 years, though. Grant leaned toward her. Do you remember when I found you? Remember? Was he kidding? It was the most memorable event of her life. She, her sister, and the other models had been trapped for days, only let out of that cramped building one at a time, and only after black canvas bags had been dropped over their heads and cinched around their necks. and only to call their families and beg them through the thick fabric to send ransom money. Their captors hadn't known Summer and Misty were sisters. Misty had called Dad, but Summer had no confidence that Dad would pay to get them back, even if he'd had the money, which he didn't. She had even less confidence that their kidnappers planned to let them go. She figured the families would send their life savings, and then the women would be sold as slaves or murdered. When it was her turn to make a phone call, she dialed John's cell. If anybody could find them and rescue them, he could. She hadn't told Misty or anybody what she'd done, afraid one of the women would let it slip. Days passed, and her hope had faltered. Tiffany was beaten so badly that her memory couldn't hang on to information for more than a few minutes. It seemed only a matter of time before the rest of the women suffered a similar fate, or worse. But then, their sixth night in captivity, gunshots pierced the air. A couple of the girls screamed, "Quiet!" She silenced them, gathered them together, and told them to be ready to move. "Misty, Cheryl, get Tiffany up, stay with her." Her sister and their friend stared, shocked. "Now!" All of them scrambled to their feet while Summer put herself between her friends and the door. Maybe rescuers would burst in. Maybe kidnappers. Either way, she would be ready. She had nothing to use as a weapon, no way to defend herself or the others. But she would fight if she had to. Shouts in Spanish, more gunfire. Then a few words of English. The door flew open. A soldier stood on the threshold. Camo-clad, he wore a helmet and black boots and held an automatic weapon, which he aimed at every corner of their room, looking for enemies. A few of the women gasped, but not Summer. She'd hoped it would be John, but she'd take this guy. She'd take anybody who could rescue them. "Come on," the man said. "Let's get you out of here." "You have another weapon?" He gave her a long, appraising look. "You know how to shoot?" She was formulating a reply, but he must have seen something in her expression. He pulled a handgun from a holster and handed it over. "As far as we can tell, they're all either dead or surrendered, but we're still clearing the buildings. You'll bring up the rear. You see anybody not dressed like me, you shoot. Got it?" "Got it." He held her eye contact another moment. "You see anybody who is dressed like me, please don't get spooked. Those are my friends out there." "I understand." She turned to the women. "Stay close. Keep up." For the first time since they'd been taken at gunpoint, she saw hope in their eyes as they passed her, following the soldier out the door. Now that soldier stared at her from across the table, watching her remember. "I'll never forget it." To her shame, emotion wavered in her voice, and her stupid eyes tingled again. "I walked through that door and saw the bravest woman I've ever seen in my life." Grant's lips tipped up at the corners, though his eyes held none of the smile. 13 terrified models, and one warrior itching to fight, demanding a gun so you could do just that. I was tired of being helpless. "I don't think you've ever been helpless." "Ha." He had no idea. At that moment, Grant's voice lowered. He shook his head. "Sheesh. You already know everything anyway. I might as well tell it all." Her heart thumped, though from anticipation or fear she couldn't have said. "When I asked you if you knew how to shoot, and you gave me that look, that don't ask stupid questions look, I fell a little bit in love with you right then." Her breath caught. "I haven't stopped falling since." "Oh, Grant. I don't need your pity." He pushed back against his chair, sipped his Coke, set it down. "Like I said, it's not your fault. You didn't know. It's my problem. I'll deal with it." He dove back into his meal. But she was too overwhelmed to eat. Grant had been in love with her for 7 years, and she'd had no idea. And now that she knew, she couldn't figure out how she felt. Because she was terrified of trusting anybody, terrified that, when push came to shove, she'd be left alone. Her mother hadn't stood between her and danger. Her older sister had escaped their household the second she was old enough, hardly ever bothering to check on her and Misty. The so-called guards who'd been hired to protect the models in Mexico had turned tail and run when Ramon's men closed in. And then, the second Misty had felt strong enough, she'd moved on with her life, leaving Summer behind. It was easier to stay alone than to discover that yet one more person she counted on had let her down. If she gave in to her feelings for Grant, he'd abandon her like everybody else had. But he'd just handed his heart over like an offering, fully expecting her to crush it. And he'd called her brave.
Chapter 22. 7 years Grant had kept secret his love for Summer. Now in the space of about 18 hours, he'd spilled everything. He'd always hoped that, when he finally told Summer how he felt, she'd admit to similar feelings. He'd hoped she'd at least be open to the idea of dating him. But his worst fears had come to pass. She'd shut him down. He chanced to glance up from his lunch, catching her as she looked away. Was that indecision in those stormy gray eyes? Or maybe he just saw what he wanted to see. Because her jaw was tight, her mouth firmly closed. Though most of her meal remained on the plate, she hadn't taken a bite in minutes. "You done?" he asked. She got the server's attention and asked for the bill. "I'm buying." Normally, he'd argue, but he didn't bother as she handed over the cash. If she felt she owed him something, if spending $15 on him would make her feel better, then so be it. As they walked out, he couldn't bring himself to regret his honesty. Now he could move on, assuming they brought Ramon down and secured her safety. Maybe if he didn't see her 5 days a week, his feelings would fade. He was 35 years old. If he wanted to get married and have a family, he needed to get started. He did want that. The family he'd been watching in the restaurant, the squirming kids, the little baby in the high chair, he wanted all of it. Was recovering from crushing heartbreak akin to recovering from the flu? Would it take a few months to find normalcy again? Or was it more like cancer? Would the cure, like chemotherapy, leave him weaker than ever? Either way, he was done hoping Summer would be his wife, the mother of his children. If she never planned to marry, then any attraction she might have felt toward him didn't matter. Her feelings, if she had any at all, were irrelevant. Seemed the wounds from her childhood cut deeper than he'd understood. They climbed into the SUV and he pulled into traffic. "Where are we going?" "I need to stop at the store, if that's all right with you." "That's fine." They were being overly polite. The easy camaraderie they'd once shared was gone. "And then we need to come up with a plan," he said. "You and I can't stake out the house 24/7. We're going to need to bring in the team. And get supplies, weapons, binoculars, comms." His phone rang, the trill too loud in the quiet car. He recognized the number and hit the button to answer. "This is Grant. I'm with Lake." "I got some information for you." Agent Galinsky's voice was monotone. Not that he ever showed much emotion. It seemed his only emotions were bored and angry. Grant signaled to change lanes, headed for the mostly empty parking lot of a little white church. Summer pulled herself from her bag and turned on a recording app. "Go ahead." "Vasco Ramon owns a ranch in central Mexico." "We know," Grant said. "Discovered that days ago. I've been looking into the ranch's holdings, property, equipment, that kind of thing. Nothing unusual except I've been following a rabbit trail that paid off today. It took some serious digging, but Ramon's business is in partnership with another business in the Cayman Islands." Galinsky said the words as if they were significant. "That's important?" Grant asked. "The Caymans are a popular place to register pleasure boats, for tax reasons and because a boat registered in the Caymans is considered a British vessel, which means it flies under the British flag and is protected by the British Royal Navy. I guess that's a big deal. And you're saying the company Ramon's ranch is partnered with owns a yacht registered in the Caymans?" "Shocking," Grant deadpanned. "Who would have guessed he had access to a yacht? Do you have any idea where it is?" Like before, Summer's voice was far more reasonable than Grant's. "It checked in with U.S. Customs in Miami 4 days ago." Summer's eyes widened. "Was the vessel searched?" "They hardly ever search pleasure boats unless they have some reason to believe. I'd think what I overheard the other day." "You overheard that conversation on Wednesday. The boat hit the U.S. on Tuesday." "Oh, right," she said. "And anyway, it's not like it's in Ramon's name. I'm just lucky I found the connection." "Ramon's not on the boat, I guess," Summer said. "They might be able to stop whatever he was planning, but unless he was present, they probably wouldn't be able to link him to the operation. She'd still be in danger. He's in Boston. Maybe he'll meet up with the boat eventually, or maybe his crew will be doing the offloading." Grant navigated to his map program, but that wouldn't be helpful. How long does it take to get from Miami to here by sea? I researched the type of yacht he has. From what I can tell, it's fast. I've got to call into someone who should be able to look up their location, assuming they have an AIS tracking system and it's on. All we know now is that they left on Thursday. They could be headed anywhere. Back to Mexico. To Cayman. They're headed to Maine, Grant said. Wait, Summer said. How do you know when they left? Talk to the guy who runs the marina where they docked in Miami. What's your guess then? Grant asked. How soon can he be here? Obviously depends on their speed. My research tells me most yachts don't go much more than 20 knots. At that rate, 3 days, give or take. So he could be here as soon as tomorrow? Grant clarified. Afternoon, maybe. Assuming they're going fast. Assuming they haven't stopped somewhere. Summer's eyes were scrunched at the corners, her head tilted to the side. But what are the chances he'll have that tracking system engaged? Don't you think it'll be turned off? I know about as much about yachts as I do about private jets and polo, Galinsky said, which is to say, nothing. Maybe they need the system to navigate, in which case, would he turn it off? Most fishing boats and even a lot of small crafts have GPS units for navigation, Grant said. I agree with Summer. I'm guessing if there is an AIS system on the boat, it'll be turned off. Which might be a red flag, but not illegal. Galinsky muttered a curse word. I don't know what to tell you then. We're going to have to watch the house. Summer shot a glance at Grant, and he nodded for her to continue. Maybe we can get the evidence you need. You see something going down? You call 911 and get out of there. No sense putting yourselves in danger. This isn't evidence enough to get the FBI involved? Not even close. Frustrating, but there was no point arguing. Call us if you get any more information. You do the same. Grant ended the call. Our window just got smaller. That's a good thing. The sooner this is over, the better. Was she so eager to be rid of him? Even as he hid the jolt of pain, he agreed, for a different reason. He'd do anything to get Summer out of danger. His job at this point was to figure out how to do what needed to be done and keep her safe at the same time.
Chapter 23. Summer wouldn't have minded heading back to the Wrights' camp for one more night. She'd brave the horrible boat ride to be surrounded by people who'd made her feel at home. But it would be awkward, considering how courteous, as opposed to friendly, she and Grant were acting toward each other. She checked in with her sisters. Both assured her they were safe. Otherwise, the drive was silent. She wasn't sorry when, less than an hour after they'd left York, they arrived at Brian's house, the empty driveway confirming what Grant had told her, that Brian had stayed with the family. Grant should have too, but instead, he was stuck with Summer. At least there was a light at the end of this nightmarish tunnel. When the yacht arrived at the Bannister house, maybe Ramon would be on it, and they could take the guy down. Otherwise, well, she didn't want to think about the alternatives. One way or another, she had to prove Ramon was a criminal, and she had to do it before he found her. She hadn't exactly mastered the art of praying, but she asked God to please work out all the details. She and Grant very politely made their way inside, and she carried her duffel bag to the room where she'd slept 2 nights before. She'd called Bartlett on the drive, but until he called her back, there was nothing to do but wait, which she intended to do in the privacy of that Pepto-Bismol pink bedroom. No need to endure any more awkward silences with Grant. Downstairs, the TV blared the shouts from some sporting event. Not much time passed, though, before a door slammed. Voices. Was that? She crept down the hall to the top of the stairs. I thought you were staying at camp. Grant's voice came from around the corner. He didn't sound happy. Brian was standing on the landing, a rolling suitcase at his side. Changed my mind. If I'd known you were going to be here, that's why I didn't tell you. No need for you to go to a hotel. Grant mumbled. Didn't want to inconvenience. You're my brother, idiot. You're not an inconvenience. Brian looked up and smiled. Hey, Summer, how you doing? Thanks for letting us come back here. I'm happy to do it. He glowered at his brother. Seriously? She didn't catch Grant's answer because her cell rang. She hurried back to the bedroom to grab it. This is Lake. I'm trying to figure it out. Bartlett, abrupt as always. We picked up a new client yesterday. That's great. She hated the thought of all those people on the payroll with no work to keep them busy or cover their salaries. From where? I've been trying to get this company's business for a while. Haven't got a long-term contract yet, but there's some big convention in town this week, and they decided they needed extra security. They wanted to hire everybody we could spare, but I kept a few back, just in case. Thanks for doing that. She hated that her trouble was costing her business money. I sent them 7. She did the math in her head. You're saying we only have 6 people available? Ian, Jones, Greta, Hughes, Marcus, and Smitty. I could shuffle some around. Jones and Hughes were very experienced. Ian was new but competent. The rest had been with the company long enough to prove their abilities. With her and Grant, that meant 8 guards. She would have preferred 4 6-hour shifts, but they'd need 3 per group. 8-hour shifts would work. Unfortunately, one of the teams would be down a man. We could hire contractors. She didn't miss the tentative tone in Bartlett's voice. Contractors would cost money the company didn't have. She considered her bank account. Yeah, she had what she'd earned as a model, but most of it was tied up in the business and her apartment. She wasn't exactly cash rich. Let me talk to Grant and see what he wants to do. Summer descended the stairs and found Grant sprawled out on the couch. As soon as he saw her, he swung his feet to the floor and sat up. She settled in the chair. Just got off the phone with Bartlett. He only has 6 people to spare. His cheeks, shaved that morning, were now covered in stubble. His lips turned down at the corners. How did that happen? She told him about the new client. He should have held more back, Grant said. He knew we might need help. It's his job to keep the business afloat. Grant's expression shifted. He squinted those dark eyes. Is it in trouble? Every day we pay people who aren't working. I get that. You hired all those new guys for the master's job. But are you saying... Bartlett had a lot of irons in the fire this winter. He was sure the work would come in. Otherwise, he'd have contracted the new hires short term. But the business hasn't come in like he'd hoped, not yet anyway. That means Grant didn't need the ins and outs of the company. He wasn't an owner. Soon enough, he wouldn't even be an employee. The point is, he can send 6 starting tomorrow. I don't want to leave a team down a man. Our team. She wasn't about to put anybody else at greater risk to protect herself. And nobody was better at this than Grant, except maybe John. He'd be back in 3 days. We need 1 more, Grant said. Doesn't have to be anybody super experienced. 1 person staked out in the woods near the road to get a visual on cars going in and out. 1 on the rocks where you were today, watching the water. I'll be in the woods at the side, watching the dock and driveway. Soon as we get confirmation, we do what Galinsky said and call 911. With any luck, the cops will be there before they get away. But even if they aren't, if we can get license plates, the cops should be able to track the cars. With luck, they'll get there in time to intercept the boat too. Summer nodded as he talked. It was a good plan. As long as Ramon's men didn't know they were there, it should work. Let's call Bartlett. Ask him to hire a subcontractor for the job. I can pay for it out of... I'll do it. Brian stepped into the living room. He must have been in his office. Grant stood. This has nothing to do with you. You just said it doesn't have to be someone experienced. I said it doesn't have to be someone super experienced. You have 0. I know how to take pictures and write down license plate numbers and make phone calls. How hard can it be? That's what you think I do for a living? Grant failed to keep the frustration out of his voice. To Summer, he said, call Bartlett. Tell him, seriously? You're not going to let me help? It could be dangerous. I can defend myself, Grant, and I'm as good a shot as you. I doubt that very much. There's a gun range down the street. Let's go. Shooting paper targets isn't the same as shooting human beings. You're planning on shooting somebody? Brian asked. Summer stood, unsure of her place in this conversation, feeling like she shouldn't be hearing it at all. but she couldn't exactly walk away. You just assume, because I have this stupid thing. Brian lifted his cane, thumped it against the hardwood. I'm helpless, but I'm not hopeless. I can't run very fast, but anything else you need me to do? You experienced in hand-to-hand combat? I can hold my own. Summer said, there shouldn't be any hand to. No? Grant's single word seemed to echo against the walls. Absolutely not. The brothers glared at each other. Summer lifted her cell. I'll make that call. Don't. Brian didn't take his eyes off his brother. I'm tired of you treating me like an invalid because of a stupid limp. I can climb, I can fight, I can shoot, and I sure as heck can read a license plate. All you need is somebody to watch, right? You're not planning on bringing these guys down. Things don't always go according to plan, Grant said. People get hurt. No kidding. Sarcasm dripped from the words. What would I know about that? Grant flinched as if wounded. Summer would rather hire a professional, but Brian wasn't wrong. They didn't need a pro. They needed someone to hide in the woods, act as lookout, and take pictures of any cars that drove to or from the property. She'd be watching the cove. She'd be more exposed. The lookout in the woods should be hidden. We're talking about 8-hour shifts, she said. Can you? He's not. I can handle that, Brian said. Grant plopped down on the sofa. Forget it. She ignored Grant. Can you sit in the same position for long periods of time? I'm talking hours, not minutes. As long as I stretch occasionally? We'll make sure you're in a position to do that. Shouldn't be a problem. From his seat on the couch, Grant said, No. Let me think about it. Because at the end of the day, she was the boss. Yes, she'd prefer a pro, but Brian wanted to do it. Just like he'd wanted her and Grant to be there. Just like he seemed to want very much to repair his relationship with his brother. If she could help with that, it would be one small thing she could do for Grant. She hoped he wouldn't hate her for it.